In the quiet villages of eastern Pennsylvania during the late 19th century, there was a name whispered more than spoken aloud. It belonged to a woman whose music could make hearts tremble and whose melodies seemed tied to shadow rather than light. Her name was Clara Weiss, though most remembered her not as a simple pianist, but as the woman who played only for the dead. While others filled parlors with cheerful tunes or serenaded crowded town squares, Clara's performances were reserved for moments of mourning. Funerals were her stage, caskets her audience, grieving families her patrons. And yet it was not sorrow alone that followed in her footsteps, but something darker, something people would only begin to understand on the day her last piece claimed 13 lives in a single night. From the old records that survived, the tales sound closer to Gothic fables than the mundane reality of frontier America. Imagine a funeral procession where the sobbing of widows is joined not by prayers, but by piano chords so mournful they leave listeners trembling for weeks after. Townfolk said her music lingered, like a haze you couldn't walk through, like the echo of a scream you thought you had dreamed. No one ever asked her to play joyous songs, and she never volunteered them. They said Clara felt that her piano wasn't made for life, it was made for death. But when her final performance ended with nearly a dozen corpses sprawled across a drawing room floor, death became more than just her muse, it became her legacy. Before we plunge deeper into this story, do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell, because it's stories like this one, dark, forgotten, and bone-chilling, that we uncover here. And in the comments below, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The earliest trace of Clara Weiss comes not from music halls or conservatories, but from a faded church registry in Reading, Pennsylvania. Born in 1856, she was the daughter of German immigrants who had fled political unrest in Europe. Her father, Johann, tried his hand at carpentry, and her mother, Liesel, took in washing to make ends meet. It was a meager life, marked by the constant creak of wagons carrying the coffins of those who had perished in the frequent epidemics that rolled through the valley. Typhoid, scarlet fever, cholera, illnesses swept through those towns like scythes in dry wheat. For most children, this reality meant an uncomfortably early acquaintance with funerals. For Clara, however, it became something else, almost a form of calling. Her fascination with death began innocently enough. When she was 8 years old, her only sister Greta succumbed to scarlet fever. During the funeral service, the organist failed to arrive on time, forcing the minister to whisper hymns without music. Clara watched her mother collapse into silence that felt emptier than grief itself. It was then, according to family lore, that Clara touched a piano for the first time. Borrowing an upright from a neighbor, she struck tentative notes, a child with no formal training. Yet the mourners swore it was as if her fingers already knew. The sound was hauntingly clear, and though it was awkward for her to find the keys, each note seemed bent toward sorrow, resonating with a heavy finality that silenced the room. Neighbors would later say that from that day forward, Clara did not smile as other children did. She carried loss in her face, like a shadow cast over her, the burden of a girl who had reached out to cradle grief and had been cradled back by it in return. By her teenage years, Clara's reputation had grown beyond her family circle. She did not play at dances, she did not play for wedding celebrations, and no amount of pleading would convince her otherwise. If you wanted Clara Weiss to play, it had to be at a funeral. Anything less, she said quietly, would be dishonest. Music, she believed, belonged to sadness, not joy. By 18, she had become the preferred musician for burials throughout the countryside, traveling by carriage with a small stool strapped behind her and sheet music that no one else recognized or understood. When questioned about her music, she replied that she wrote it herself, though she never allowed anyone to look closely at her pages. Witnesses remembered the strange notation, an unsettling blend of traditional staves and symbols they could not place, every margin filled with sigils or marks that to them looked more like runes than notes. The music she played was slow, sometimes painfully so, with long silences that stretched into discomfort. Mourners described how, in the moments between her chords, they felt the air itself thicken, as if the room couldn't breathe until the next sound. Conversations began. Was Clara gifted with a knack for channeling melancholy, or was there something unnatural in her performances? Something that edged past music and into the occult. Some swore her music left them drained, with dreams of their departed loved ones walking through their homes that night. A farmer's widow once testified that she heard her husband's voice humming the song Clara had played the day after the funeral, though he had been buried beneath the frozen earth only hours earlier. Another claimed that after hearing Clara play, every clock in his house had stopped at the same moment. Then there were the deaths. Small at first, subtle. An elderly aunt collapsed at the wake. A child who went to bed after the burial of her grandmother and never woke up. Whispers began that Clara's music did not just mourn the dead, it invited more. And yet families still called on her. Something was mesmerizing in her performances, something they could not turn away from. She had become not just an accompanist to grief, but its embodiment. And in death-haunted counties of Pennsylvania, that was a service people craved, even as it frightened them. By 1882, Clara moved to Philadelphia, lured by relatives who believed she might find a more respectable way to channel her gift. But her reputation quickly followed, and so did her peculiar demands. She refused offers from parlors and theaters, but eagerly accepted invitations to funerals in the city. By this point, she no longer carried music sheets. Witnesses saw her sit at the piano, glance only once at the coffin before her, then begin effortlessly weaving what people later described as music shaped not by keys, but by the life of the corpse it honored. A merchant swore she played a tune that described his late wife's laugh better than words ever could. Another mourned his son, but left the service convinced he had watched Clara put his boy into the ground, not with shovelfuls of dirt, but with cords that sealed him away forever. One undertaker, a man named Charles Reeve, recorded an unsettling pattern in his ledgers. On weeks when Clara Weiss played, the death rate in his district spiked by almost a quarter. Sudden heart attacks, unexplained accidents, fevers that burned out of nowhere. He wrote in a private journal that he dreaded her presence. "She blesses me with work," he wrote, "but every time her fingers touch an instrument, the city grows darker." It all built toward a single evening in November of 1889. The home of a textile magnate, Edward Lawton, became host to both a funeral and what history would remember as a night of inexplicable disaster. Lawton's daughter, Amelia, had died suddenly of what was described as nervous exhaustion. His family demanded that Clara Weiss perform. She arrived quietly, wrapped in a black shawl despite the mild weather, and set herself before the gleaming piano in the parlor as dozens of mourners crowded the house. Witnesses claimed her first notes caused the chandeliers to tremble. Halfway through her piece, guests complained of nausea, an oppressive weight pressing on their chests. A clergyman later swore he saw figures moving in the corners of the room that were not among the living. By the time Clara reached her final crescendo, 13 people had collapsed. Some would claim strokes, others heart failure. Doctors had no clear explanation, though Lawton himself died gasping only feet from the coffin. Clara closed the piano, stood, and left the home without a word. What became of her afterward is clouded, wrapped in rumor and fragment. Some claim she fled to New York, others said she was institutionalized, and a few whispered she never left that house alive, her body vanishing with the dead she summoned. But like all stories whispered in the dark, fragments of truth ripple beneath the surface. Old records suggest Clara Weiss may have been more than an eccentric pianist, but the deeper we look, the more disturbing the picture becomes. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who also loves the darker side of history. After the disaster at the Lawton residence, newspapers whispered their suspicions, though none dared print her name outright. Obituaries for the 13 who perished spoke of illness, of sudden collapse, of unforeseen tragedy brought on by grief. But behind closed doors, in hushed conversations in taverns and parlors, the cause always came back to one detail: the pianist, the woman who played only at funerals. Clara Weiss had taken on a myth of her own. She was no longer Clara to them, but simply the mourner, a figure who arrived not with consolation, but with the mark of death trailing behind her. Rumors circulated that the Lawton family itself tried to conceal any direct tie. In letters uncovered years later by a local historian, Edward's surviving son wrote bitterly of how those hours snatched not only our sister, but our father, and sealed our house in silence. He mentioned Clara only once, referring to her as that dreadful woman whose hands opened the gates. For months afterward, no household in Philadelphia would hire her, no parlor would welcome her presence. Accounts vary as to whether she attempted to leave the city immediately. Some claimed she was seen in New York's Bowery district, a pale woman wrapped in widow's black, haunting an old piano shop late at night. Others swore she retreated to the countryside, near the rolling farmlands of Berks County, where her family roots lay deeper than most realized. Despite these swirling contradictions, one thread unites every account. Clara never performed again in any public capacity. Yet the legend of her final performance began to sprout broader roots. Across Pennsylvania and well into neighboring states, whispers of the Pianist of Death emerged like folklore. Young children repeated ghost stories of a woman whose piano could call spirits. Superstitious farmers claimed their livestock shied at the sound of Bach, believing Clara's essence could attach itself to any tune after dark. Cynics dismissed these stories, saying they were exaggerations born from hysteria and grief. And yet, pharmacists stocked more opiates than usual. Ministers increased sermons on temptation and death, and at least 2 physicians wrote that their patients recounted Clara in their nightmares. It's important to understand the socio-political climate here, because legends rarely sprout in isolation. By the late 19th century, America was wrestling with 2 powerful forces. On one hand, it was the dawn of modern science and industrial optimism, electricity spreading, railroads binding states, and medicine discovering germs and antiseptics. On the other hand, it was the era of spiritualism, when seances and speaking to the dead captured the imagination of every parlor society. Harriet Beecher Stowe herself had admitted to attending. Mediums thrived, charlatans promised loved ones voices, and Ouija boards began their infamous careers. Clara Weiss, whether knowingly or not, fit neatly between these worlds. She was flesh and blood, and yet her music bore the hallmarks of something spectral. An 1893 article from the Spirit Telegraph, a now defunct publication devoted to mystical topics, included a brief write-up about her, though never naming her explicitly. The article recounted a woman pianist, whose melodies summon grief strong enough to anchor souls upon the threshold of this realm and the next. For spiritualists, she became a kind of folk saint. For skeptics, she was a cautionary tale to prove how gullible people could be when faced with misfortune. But for Clara herself, if alive during those years, the silence must have been deafening. Music that had defined her very existence, whether curse or calling, was no longer hers to wield publicly. Private letters, uncovered in estate sales generations later, suggest that Clara attempted to correspond with one surviving cousin, a man named Ernst Müller. In a letter attributed to her handwriting style, dated 1891, she wrote the line, "Each note I play takes something, leaves me emptier, but the silence leaves me worse." This document, if genuine, reveals a woman tormented not merely by the suspicion of others, but by an imprisonment within herself. She did not celebrate her talents. She endured them, and still the shadow of the Lawton tragedy grew. Investigations attempted to calculate how so many bodies could fail at once. Some blamed gaslight fixtures in the room, speculating a leak had suffocated guests. Others hinted at food poisoning from the extravagant feast that had followed. But old undertaker Charles Reeve, who had long tracked Clara's troubling correlation with death rates, insisted that the law should have pursued her. His journal, hidden in his granddaughter's attic until 1974, reads, "I know her, the girl with black fingers. Death follows not behind her but through her. She binds it in every key." When such a testimony resurfaces in later decades, it is tempting to read it as melodrama. But it carries one unique detail few outsiders knew. Reeve noted symbols on her sheet music early in her career. What if Clara was inscribing something more than notes? Were those sigils, as townsfolk had called them, primitive attempts at ritual? Scholars of occult tradition suggest a chilling possibility, that Clara, knowingly or unknowingly, encoded patterns of resonance meant not for human audiences, but for whatever dwells beyond perception. Resonance is not just sound, it is vibration, and vibration is energy. Could certain patterns lower defenses in human biology, disturb the pulse, or cause unsteady breathing? Science has demonstrated that infrasound, sound waves below human hearing, can cause intense unease, panic, and even hallucinations. While Clara certainly wasn't manipulating technology, is it so far-fetched that through obsessive trial and raw intuition, she stumbled upon the architecture of dread in music? As whispers faded into the new century, Clara's story mostly disappeared from formal records. Yet in oral tradition she expanded into myth. Some versions insisted she sold her soul at her sister's grave. Others went further, declaring she was never human at all, but a revenant sent to thin the veil. The dissonance of her legacy lies in this gap. Legend inflates fear, yet fragments of evidence ground her in reality. A neighbor's note here, a cousin's desperate letter there. Each piece is enough to suggest something lived and breathed behind the dirty lace curtains of Pennsylvania homes. But perhaps most unsettling is how Clara's final documented appearance. Lawton's wake resonates with the survivors. One elderly mourner, recorded in her nursing home in 1922, described the moment herself. The last keys trembled, like breath already parting. I thought I saw Amelia rise in her coffin. Not in flesh, no, but as if the air around her swelled and stood. Then the room broke and people fell like cords cut. Her testimony, frail though her recall may have been, lingers with chilling clarity. What remains certain, Clara's legacy defies simple dismissal. The alignments are too precise, the pattern too repetitive. Death enters on her left hand, lingers in her right, and departs with silence trailing. Whatever truly happened within those parlor walls cannot be repeated. Still, her presence echoes down history as a warning. Music intended for grief may bleed into music that calls grief nearer. Our journey into Clara Weiss's shadow has only just begun. Records reveal more, and the connection between her strange symbols and greater movements of esoteric societies in the 19th century grows darker by the page. The tragedy of the Lawtons and the whispers about Clara might have seemed destined to collapse into folklore, the way so many unsettling local stories did. Yet in the decades that followed, fragments of her presence kept resurfacing like bones, pushing through layers of soil. These fragments came from journals, scattered court records, and above all, the stories of those who insisted Clara had left an imprint not just on people but on the very fabric of their towns. In 1901, 2 decades after Clara's last known performance, Philadelphia's Historical Quarterly published a curious essay by Felix Turnbull, a university lecturer known for his fascination with music anthropology. The essay seemed unrelated at first, an exploration of melodic motifs in immigrant folk traditions. But tucked between bland commentary on Germanic hymns and Irish ballads, Turnbull admitted that among Pennsylvania's immigrant communities there persisted an unusual melodic strain, reserved exclusively for funerary rites. He noted it was so sorrowful in tone that listeners described physical reaction, hands grown cold, breath slowed to labored pacing, a tendency toward fainting. Though he dismissed supernatural claims, he wrote that this music was traced to a certain woman of shadowy record, whose funerary pieces became infamous not for comfort but calamity. He never named her, though how many in turn-of-the-century Philadelphia needed him to. An even stranger connection emerged when old probate records were examined decades later. In 1903, a Philadelphia lawyer named Isaac Drexel handled a peculiar estate dispute involving the minor inheritance of a piano presumably belonging to C.W. The case files survive in fragments only. Still, witnesses deposed claimed the piano had been tainted and that none of the deceased's relatives wanted it in their homes. In one transcript, Drexel himself admitted his clerks refused to remain in the office overnight with the instrument stored there, reporting they heard chords strummed without hands, a faint repetition of unfamiliar dirges in the quieter hours. The piano eventually disappeared from the official record, auctioned, lost, or destroyed. Those interested in the supernatural have always wondered whether this was Clara's instrument. But perhaps the most unsettling revival of Clara's specter arrived in 1910, during an outbreak of influenza around Lancaster County. Physicians remarked in letters to each other about a phenomenon of dread, sweeping local households faster than infection itself. Families reported hearing piano melodies drift through closed windows at night. Melodies they did not own pianos to play. The songs carried the spectral sorrow familiar to older generations who had once heard Clara's notorious performances with their own ears. The influenza claimed hundreds of local lives, and while no scientific link can of course be established, among locals the appearance of phantom music became inseparable from the mounting death toll. They whispered that the mourner had returned. Someone had called her music back into the living world. The pattern is critical. Clara was not remembered in isolation. Her legend seemed to awaken in times of communal grief or crisis, from influenza to industrial accidents. Towns on edge did not simply tell the old story. They seemed to hear its echoes again, as if grief itself resummoned her. Could it be collective hysteria? Certainly. But hysteria itself reveals what anchors people's deepest terrors. And Clara had become a symbol large enough to haunt without physical presence. By the 1920s, an age of jazz, electricity, speed, and optimism, the legend of Clara Weiss was supposed to be obsolete, something your grandfather feared but you laughed at in speakeasies. Yet the paradox is that modernity often reawakens folklore. Ghosts thrive not in darkness but in contrast with bright light, and in the 1920s, a series of articles began recirculating about the death pianist of Philadelphia. These sensationalized accounts appeared in pulp magazines, drawing from letters and trial notes likely scavenged from archives. Writers exaggerated everything. Clara was recast as a witch, her piano keys described as carved from bones. The chandelier's collapse at the Lawtons presented as if demons swung upon it themselves. But exaggeration still relies on a seed of truth. While scholars quickly dismissed the pulp accounts, they also drew new attention to forgotten official records of her real existence. Thus, Clara entered the twin worlds of legitimate historical curiosity and lurid fiction simultaneously. What sets her apart from mere ghost story fodder, however, is the strange consistency of testimony across decades. Not only mourners but surviving relatives described the same effects. Cold air descending when she played, hearts troubling themselves against their normal rhythm, a silence at the end so deep it pressed against the mind. These reports spread from families who had no contact with each other. Could so many independent witnesses misremember identically? Skeptics argue yes, fear is contagious, recollections shift to fit collective patterns. Yet believers argue no, the details are fixed too uniformly. Lending further intrigue, Clara's name arises in unexpected places within occult writings in the late 19th century. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, that esoteric society based in London but influential throughout the Western world, featured scattered mentions of a woman attuned to occluded harmonics in the Pennsylvania territories. One marginal note in a private diary by Aleister Crowley himself, whether genuine or attributed, is said to describe a Clara who conceives melodies that part veils. Such fragments must be treated carefully, but if they hold authenticity, they suggest that Clara caught the attention of occult circles far beyond her rural communities. Yet even in examining these, one must pause. How would she herself have described what she did? The one surviving letter in Ernst Müller's archives, already quoted, hints that while the outside world saw her as predatory, she felt devoured herself. "Each note I play takes something, leaves me emptier," she wrote. Isn't there a suggestion of compulsion? Not hunger but purge, not drawing joy from her craft but being hollowed out each time. If Clara were still alive long into the 20th century, would she have been less monster and more victim of uncontrollable resonance flowing through her? Regardless of interpretation, her silence after 1889 must have been its own torment. To live with something one can neither embrace nor amputate is its own slow death. By the mid-20th century, many concluded Clara had perished unknown, perhaps buried under another name in a small cemetery somewhere. Yet her story never quite died. Paranormal investigators in the 1950s and again in the 1970s revived interest, treating her as a case study in acoustic haunting. Some experimented with recordings, attempting to recreate Clara's described progressions of sound, using dissonant chords, heavy sustains, and prolonged silences. Curious results followed. Volunteers reported unease, headaches, and even fainting when exposed for long durations. Of course, critics argued this resulted from the suggestion, but still the old question lingered. Had Clara stumbled upon resonances that genuinely disrupted human equilibrium? By the close of the 20th century, Clara Weiss had become far more than a strange woman in an old county archive. She had transformed into a symbol of grief's ability to engender myth, of music's unsettling power, of the uncanny intersection between performance and mortality. And details persist into recent decades. A Philadelphia urban legend tells of midnight funerals in Laurel Hill Cemetery, where an older woman in black supposedly appears at the piano in the chapel. Visitors have claimed to hear muffled chords from behind locked doors. Cemetery staff deny any knowledge, but those who have experienced it insist the resonance of grief, like Clara herself, never truly vanished from Pennsylvania's soil. If this story chills you, remember that sometimes our past is not buried. It waits for us humming just beyond hearing. By the early 20th century, interest in Clara Weiss from serious historians had nearly evaporated. Yet, threads of her story began finding new life among those more concerned with the relationship between science, sound, and the uncanny. The turn of the century was marked by invention. Thomas Edison tinkered with the phonograph. Nikola Tesla spoke of vibrations underlying all energy. These were men convinced that resonance was not merely auditory but elemental, that sound itself could shape matter unseen. To them, the universe thrummed with hidden frequencies, frequencies that perhaps could be manipulated. And into those conversations, Clara's legend slipped like a shadow along a wall. While urbanites dismissed her as myth, occultists and small circles of experimental scientists found curiosity in the strange mathematics of her grief-filled chords. Did Clara stumble upon accidental harmonics, or was her intuition sharper than theories catching up half a century later? Certain sound frequencies below human hearing, what modern physics terms infrasound, produce vertigo, anxiety, and dread. Clara may have lacked vocabulary for these forces, but found them, guided not by experiments, in labs, but by instinct, born of grief. Letters between European sound, theorists from the 1920s make scattered, reference to dissonant musics of America, and the accounts of funerary pianos that drew fatal synchrony. 1. German physicist Ernst Vetter scrawled in his notebook, "What organ pipes cannot do deliberately, this Clara seems to have achieved without intention." The body becomes the drum. It beats irregularly under her influence. Music is contagion, deadly. Whether these men truly believed the accounts or merely toyed with campfire tales, their notes suggest something persistent. Clara's name carried halfway across the globe, whispered even among academic inquiry. Back in Pennsylvania, where the soil seemed unable to release her, whispers linked Clara not only to sound, but to symbol. Some surviving witnesses described that in her youth, she scrawled marks unusual for sheet music, curves, and symbols that vanished in her later years once she memorized her craft. Folklorists began speculating. Perhaps Clara had been influenced by remnants of European folk mysticism carried through her immigrant family. Old charms, household runes to ward grief, transformed under her pen into structured resonance. If she wove them into staves, was she writing music to guide souls into stillness, or calling something unspeakable to linger among the living? This speculation found fuel in secretive societies rising in Philadelphia during the 19th century. Beyond the Golden Dawn's marginal notes, records hinted gatherings of harmonists, small groups, convinced that tonal geometry formed the core of mystical power. If fragments of Clara's work reached their ears, it is not impossible they seized upon her as proof. Indeed, some of their writings in the 1890s specifically reference the mourner of the valley, as if she were a case study. Her tragedy both feared and revered. But the most disturbing element is less mystical and more banal. Modern researchers have pointed out how persistently trauma and death clung to Clara long before she became a myth. Losing her sister young anchored music not in joy but in mourning. She associated the piano with graves before she ever knew parlors or dance halls. And from then onward, she shaped her identity exclusively around grief. Some call this a pathology, trauma sculpting her only sense of purpose until she could only express sorrow and conjure it from others. If true, the devastation following her would be tragic, but tragically human. Yet the accounts resist this explanation because the phenomenon surrounding Clara was not limited to subjective sorrow. People fainted, fell ill, or even died. Critics explain these outcomes as a coincidence, collective anxiety, or medical fragility worsened by grief. But believers insist that too many incidents occurred, too many aligned deaths to be dismissed. And then there is Lawton's 13. No rational assessment explains why a single evening produced so many sudden corpses. How could coincidence stretch to what reads like a catastrophe? We are left with a paradox. Either a fragile young woman unknowingly magnified communal grief until hysteria consumed her towns, or Clara Weiss tapped frequencies of reality that pressed into the human body in ways both subtle and fatal. Fast forward now to mid-century America. The folklore of Clara sleeps quietly, but strange revivals occur. In 1958, a graduate student in musicology at Temple University stumbled upon Reeve the Undertaker's journals while cataloging estate donations. Fascinated, she transcribed key passages speaking of Clara and her deadly aftermath. She included them in a campus paper. Local journalists soon ran stories. Letters to the editor arrived, readers swearing their grandparents spoke of attending her funerals. Others swore they heard phantom piano sounds in houses where coffins once lay. Philadelphia buzzed once again with her shadow. It is telling that this revival coincided with burgeoning interest in the paranormal across post-war America. Horror films, supernatural enthusiasm, popular fiction about Dracula, and restless ghosts, cultural currents searched for reminders that the rational world was still permeable by dread. Clara, long buried in archives and whispers, now returned as almost a local attraction. Amateur tape recorders were taken into graveyards to capture ghostly piano tones. Tour guides in Reading spun spooky tales under candlelight. Always, though, the chilling question returned. Who was Clara really, and where had she vanished after her last night? The silence is itself unnerving. We have no record of her death, no obituary, no grave marked in her name. Did she marry under another identity, die in some asylum unrecorded? Or, as sensationalists prefer, was she herself taken that night with the Lawtons, drawn through the gate she had so long seemed to open with her piano? That absence of conclusion fuels the fire, because unknown fates never rest. Evidence leans toward her surviving at least briefly beyond 1889. Those scattered letters in the 1890s suggest she lived quietly, perhaps under relatives' care. Yet the fact that no record of her burial exists means her story lacks the mundane closure that might diffuse myth. The community filled her silence with their own answers, shaping her into more shadow than woman. And that, of course, is how legends survive. But Clara's legend carries something unique compared to most folklore. It is tethered not only to tales, but to documented tragedy. We have hospital records listing those dead from Lawton's parlor. We have journal entries, official ledgers, and names. She is not a phantom conjured whole cloth. She is a real human whose presence is attested, and around whom rational explanation crumbles. What audiences today must realize, what chills descend upon those who dig, is that the distance between folklore and fact in Clara's case is razor thin, and perhaps that is why she haunts so powerfully. Her story is not comfortingly far in fairyland. It stands uncomfortably close to the line of evidence. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries the way you do. What is remarkable about Clara Weiss is not simply her shadow in the 19th century, but how steadily her name re-emerged long afterwards, as if each generation found it necessary to exhume her music anew. By the time America entered the modern era of highways and skyscrapers, you would expect the mourner of Pennsylvania to be forgotten in the clutter of technology. Yet in strange ways, her story rooted itself deeper as decades unfolded. During the 1960s, as the nation flirted with spiritual experimentation, Clara was dragged back into the spotlight by a wave of investigators who considered folklore evidence of larger truths hiding beneath the everyday. Paranormal research groups were forming across the country, often amateur, sometimes laughable, always enthusiastic. Among them were two students from the University of Pennsylvania who undertook a project exploring regional necrotic lore. They tracked down elderly residents in Berks County who had family memories of Clara. What they recorded on their tape decks astonished them. One woman of 91 years, identified in transcripts only as Mrs. P, spoke with a trembling voice about hearing Clara play in her childhood. She remembered the faint sobbing tone, how the air seemed to turn sharp in her lungs, and how for weeks afterwards neighbors fell ill. When asked if she felt Clara was evil, Mrs. P shook her head. No, child. She was sorrow itself. Evil is greedy. Sorrow is full but hollow. She was that. These kinds of testimonies carried power because they resisted sensationalizing Clara as some witch or demon. They framed her instead as a vessel, perhaps unwilling, through whom sadness magnified into something unbearable. One legend revived and then became particularly widespread, that Clara's music did not end with silence but left an imprint in the houses where she played. Families later occupying such homes spoke of faint piano strains at night, especially during storms or when death was imminent in the household. These claims multiplied until paranormal enthusiasts in the 1970s began seeking out former residences of the deceased where Clara had once performed. Their tape recorders captured faint noises, Rarely clear but unsettling enough to spawn radio programs speculating about the ghost pianist of Philadelphia. In 1974, a group calling itself the Mid-Atlantic Psychical Research Committee visited an abandoned farmhouse said to have hosted a Clara performance decades before. They reported that as midnight fell, their instruments measured sudden drops in temperature and an unexplained resonance within wooden beams. One member claimed to faintly hear a string of sorrowful chords, though no piano stood anywhere near. Skeptics rightly countered that sound can be carried by wind, and resonance can be misinterpreted. But believers insisted the group had encountered not mere echoes but imprints of Clara's resonance left upon the structures themselves. This notion of resonance became crucial to how later thinkers reimagined her story. If every action creates vibration, then extreme emotion in performance might scar the environment with its frequency. Clara, always playing in rooms thick with grief, might have layered those spaces with mourning so dense it never left. Her legend thus crossed from supernatural horror into discussions about physics, memory, and space. To hear Clara's phantom notes was, in this sense, to overhear the vibration of history itself. Through the 1980s and 1990s, pop culture found Clara a haunting muse. A paperback horror novel entitled The Mourner's Chords fictionalized her life, claiming she played upon piano keys carved from her sister's bones. A made-for-television documentary on haunted Pennsylvania homes dramatized her final concert with eerie music boxes. Folklorists published essays exploring community trauma attached to her story, the way clusters of unexplained illness paired with memory of her music. Each new retelling added embellishments. The 13 dead grew to 16, later to 20. Some insisted her final song literally cracked the chandelier, although records confirm it remained intact throughout. In the telling of legends, detail swells until the true horror becomes buried like a skeleton in overgrown ground. Yet through all these flourishes, one undeniable truth remained. Clara Weiss existed, she played, and tragedies followed. Even modern science has nodded toward her case with curiosity, if not belief. In 1997, an acoustics researcher at MIT wrote a paper on the psychological and physiological effects of elongated piano chords paired with silence, and witnessed responses in test subjects strikingly close to those described about Clara's audiences: palpitations, dizziness, dread. He never mentioned Clara by name, but described his inspiration as an unnamed funerary pianist reported in late 1800s Pennsylvania. Thus, through indirect means, Clara seeped into academic journals again. As we edge nearer the contemporary moment, whispers about Clara come most often in story-swapping forums, the sort of internet boards where urban legends pool like rain in uneven stone. Contributors trade accounts of pianos that play themselves at night in Philadelphia, and houses where you cannot breathe when you cross the threshold. Clara's ghost is dragged into modern haunting, tales almost instinctively, showing again her staying power. And yet, for online audiences no less than those of the 1800s, the most chilling element is her humanity. We are not certain she asked for any of it. Was she a predator, or offering herself unknowingly for history to consume? What pushes Clara's myth away from being dismissed entirely is not just supernatural resonance, but survivors who continued insisting until their deathbeds that her music altered them. It's easy to scoff at tales of rattling chandeliers or spectral sounds, but not as easy to dismiss consistent bodily effects: cold hands, slowed breath, sudden illness. Individual psychology? Perhaps. But repetition across decades, across unrelated families, produces a body of testimony that unnerves even skeptics. Imagine what it must have been like, being a guest at one of those funerals. You sit in a mourning parlor, heavy already with grief, and she touches the piano. Silence deepens at her pauses. Notes fall like weighted shovelfuls of dirt, and with each chord, a room of lungs exhales differently. You might go home thinking only of sadness, and yet, a week later, you collapse. Is it a coincidence, or was that chord still echoing inside you? The unsettling truth is this: all great legends endure because they merge what is believable with what is unbearable. Clara lived, Clara played, Clara surrounded herself in funerals, and Clara's legacy is that entire rooms of mourners fell ill or died. At what point myth begins, no one quite knows. But staring back from the archives is her name, undeniably signed where stories root themselves. And that is the essence of Clara Weiss today. A figure half in history, half in nightmare, stared at cautiously through the cracked lid of an old piano case. Her fingers are gone from this world, but the mourning they drew from instruments has never stopped trembling across the land that birthed her. The Lawton residence, November 1889, remains the centerpiece of Clara Weiss's legend. If all other scraps of her story dissolve into rumor, this night stands out sharp and undeniable. It is here that tragedy and testimony intersect so violently that even skeptics are forced to pause. We must tread carefully, not rushing to the aftermath, but walking slowly through the details of what witnesses described and what investigators could not ignore. The Lawtons were wealthy, their home a showpiece of Philadelphia's new industrial elite. Their daughter Amelia's sudden death stunned society, though nervous exhaustion was a vague diagnosis often used in those years. Behind whispers of poor health lay suspicion that grief of romance, perhaps scandal, had weakened her. But whatever private judgment haunted those halls, the family determined to display their mourning with somber grandeur. They hired Clara Weiss. Some objected. Memories of fainting spells at her services had already circulated. But Edward Lawton, Amelia's father, insisted. She played sorrow as no one else could, and sorrow, he thought, was truth. Guests arrived in heavy carriages, boots scraping November's chill. Inside the parlor, the coffin lay open near the piano, a gleaming walnut upright polished for the occasion. Shrouded mirrors hid reflections, silken curtains dulled lamplight, and flowers released a sweetness so dense it edged toward sickly. Those who gathered remembered quiet conversations abruptly halting when Clara entered. She wore black as always, head veiled, and carried no pages of music. The sight of her, thin, reserved, eyes hollowed by shadows of sleeplessness, was enough to wilt remaining chatter. Edward Lawton himself escorted her to the piano, bowing slightly as he gestured to her seat. Survivors later described how the first notes seemed harmless enough, low chords, deliberate, stretched wide. Yet almost at once, tension thickened in the ribs of those present, as though the room's air had grown viscous. Some clutched fabrics tighter about their arms, though coal fires already glowed. A young boy admitted he felt pressure on his chest within the second minute. The minister coughed repeatedly, unable to clear his throat. And Clara's eyes, those few who braved to look, appeared glazed, as though unseeing anything but the music itself. Her pauses became daggers. After each dense chord fell, silence blossomed so sharply that guests shifted uneasily, desperate for her next sound. One woman recalled later that she fought to exhale during the stillness, uneasy that breathing might shatter whatever spell gripped the room. Then her hand struck again, slow, mournful ascents, crescendos rising like cries in cathedral arches until collapsing back into abyssal tones. That pattern repeated, each cycle driving discomfort deeper. By 20 minutes in, witnesses believed they saw chandeliers sway despite no draft, and puddles beneath candles, their wax melting at an unnatural pace. Whether embellishments of anxious hindsight or true details, their consistency across accounts cannot be ignored. Several reported nausea. Some complained of throbbing headaches, fists pressing against temples. And still Clara played, expressionless, body rigid with something more determined than artistry. Halfway through, testimony grows bizarre. One mourner claimed Amelia herself stirred within the coffin. Another swore that he glimpsed shifting forms near paintings, shapes bending like heat. 13 witnesses, all from different corners of the room, described simultaneous cold breezes spiraling down their spines, though no windows stood ajar. Science cannot confirm such claims. Yet we cannot dismiss the power of atmosphere, grief, and sound twisted into uncanny resonance. Then, the fall. Edward Lawton, seated proudly near his daughter's coffin, collapsed first. His face grayed, his hands clawed at his chest, and he tumbled forward across chairs before striking the hardwood with a crack. Clara did not pause. Her hands swept across keys undeterred, chords swallowing gasps. Within moments, 2 others fell. A cousin slumped, eyes rolled back. An elderly aunt groaned once and was silent. Panic rippled not at once, but in waves, because the mourners were trapped in the undertow of her chords. Rather than rushing to aid, many froze, staring aghast, as if waiting for permission to move. By the song's climax, the parlor echoed with cries and thuds. 13 in all dropped before her fingers lifted. Doctors rushed hours later to declare strokes, heart failure, and shock. But how, reason demanded, could bodies fall so uniformly? 13 souls stilled during a single hour, under a single soundtrack. The odds defy chance into the realm of nightmare. Clara closed the piano without bowing. Witnesses remember her standing, veil dragging across polished wood, then moving toward the door with steps so measured it seemed rehearsed. She vanished into the night, never again to publicly perform. Some swore her expression as she left was neither sorrow nor guilt, but relief. As though something concluded had freed her from endless repetition. What investigators found the next day only deepened confusion. Instruments of gas examination revealed no leaks. Food upon tables, though conspicuously untouched after so many fell, contained no known poisons. The room held nothing but echoes. The doctor's reports, bound in Philadelphia archives, note cause of death, inconclusive, likely weak constitutions aggravated by emotional distress. But they wrote that reluctantly, as though ashamed. The truth is, the room itself remained inexplicable. This night is Clara Weiss's legacy. Everything speaking of her must return here, to the moment her chords became synonymous not with grief alone, but with annihilation. Whether by freak resonance, supernatural call, or psychological contagion, she escorted 13 into shadow. History's ink cannot erase that number. Folklore insists she vanished utterly after this departure. Skeptics suppose she was admitted to an asylum under another name. Believers whisper that she herself was claimed, drawn away in that final chord along with those she felled. What remains undeniable is the terror stitched into the Lawtons' final night. Guests awoke for decades with dreams of the music. Philadelphia children whispered never to hum funeral tunes in case the woman in black came tapping at their windows. Clara had always belonged to death. But here, death took her audience not only metaphorically, but literally. And because no clear cause could be written on medical forms, her story was never locked safely in one cabinet. It spread, an infection of imagination given roots in genuine tragedy. And so we return, again and again, to that image. A parlor heavy with flowers, a coffin near an upright piano, guests overcome by sound, while one lone woman in black plays without falter, believing she serves grief while serving something hungrier. When Clara Weiss stepped silently from the Lofton household into the ink of a Philadelphia autumn night, it was as though history itself could not follow. From that moment forward, the official record holds nothing. No court summons, though questions remained. No asylum intake, despite rumors. No newspapers named her in accusations, though whispers testified. No grave marked Clara Weiss's passage. She vanished beyond the reach of bureaucracy, cartographers of history, and neighborhood gossips alike. For a figure who had etched tragedy so vividly, her sudden silence has become the truest specter haunting us still. The Lawton family, ruined by the double blow of Amelia's death and Edward's sudden collapse, closed their residence within weeks. Surviving children left Philadelphia altogether, and those who inherited swore never to utter Clara's name again. Their decision echoed across society: suppress what could not be explained. When wealth and status cannot protect against calamity, silence becomes the last instrument of defense, and so Clara's name dwindled from drawing rooms into whispers, hushed over bar counters, and murmured in kitchens late at night. Yet those who attended that evening could not bury the memory so easily. One mourner later recorded her confusion in a journal. "I still hear her song as though it continues without her. I wake with its silence grinding my breath." Another wrote to a confidant that he feared his house itself, retains her keys as if the walls repeat the vibration indefinitely. The fact that 13 bodies had been carried out meant Clara could never be a private rumor again. And though investigators refrained from attributing cause, ordinary citizens knew what they felt. The mourner's final performance was an open secret, its horror too palpable ever to die. Decades passed, and Clara survived as an echo. In the early 1900s, when families compared her to mediums or spoke of parlor seances, her name became cautionary. Beware those who promise to bridge grief through sound. In rural homesteads, children were warned against striking certain chords after sunset. They were told, play the mourner's intervals too long, and someone in your house will not wake. These half-truths circulated with amazing resilience. Folk belief does not require documented evidence. It requires emotional glue, and Clara provided buckets of that in her silent eyes and spare haunting notes. Theories multiplied. One persistent idea was that Clara did not abandon her craft voluntarily. Believers insist that the act of playing for Amelia and her doomed guests had drained the last of her, and that she herself did not walk down cobblestones afterward, but disintegrated into the night air. That is, she was consumed by the very resonance she drew from the piano. Others argued she was taken, claimed by the spirit she had so long woven into dirge. Her disappearance thus felt more myth than migration, but even practical minds puzzled by coincidence could not resolve the count of 13. Too many bodies, too sudden. Medical explanations remained unsatisfactory. If it had been gas fumes, all should have fallen. If it's food poisoning, it's not simultaneous. If grief, why so consistent in that one evening alone? Even skeptics paused after seeing signed coroner records, names aligned side by side with no rational pattern. Legends feed on numbers, and 13, positioned in Western superstition as unlucky, only amplified narrative. This vacuum of clarity gave license to occultists. Whether Golden Dawn associates noted the woman of funerary harmonics, or local societies whispered of her sigils, Clara became a symbol of resonance as a gateway. Some claimed she found the chord that lowers veils between the living and the dead. Others suggested she discovered vibrational sympathy, the way bodies respond like strings when certain notes are struck. In this theory, Clara's music unknowingly disrupted the rhythms of breath and heartbeat. Listeners matched her sorrow not emotionally but physically, fatally. Psychologists in mid-century argued differently, that Clara represents trauma externalized in myth. A child haunted by lost channels grief until the community itself sees her as a channel of tragedy. By playing exclusively at funerals, she embodies sorrow, fulfills expectations, and becomes a scapegoat when deaths appear. Under this generous interpretation, Clara was not a predator, but a prisoner of a role thrust upon her. Yet the problem persists. Scapegoats may be hated, but they do not simultaneously inspire a collective loss of faith. During the 20th century resurgences, particularly in the 1970s, folklorists collected extraordinary consistency from unrelated families recalling residual phenomena in houses where she had played. They spoke of muffled songs through boarded floors, cold drafts during anniversaries, and clocks stopping during phantom dirges. Could these be mass misremembered details shaped by superstition? Yes, but repetition across decades places Clara not with comic phantoms like headless horsemen, but closer to uneasy truths. Science adds its chilling possibility. Research into infrasound, the low vibrations below human hearing that induce dread, nausea, apparitions of vision, matches exactly what Clara's audiences described. Did this fragile woman intuitively orchestrate chords that produced infrasound in enclosed wooden parlors? If so, she weaponized resonance without knowledge, crafting atmospheres that sickened, destabilized, even perhaps killed. 13 victims of the Laughtons could, by this lens, represent bodies whose fragile constitutions simply could not survive that resonance. Yet even this explanation fails to solve her disappearance. Even if we concede that her music struck fatal notes, who can account for a woman disappearing from the local archive immediately after? We have thousands of death certificates from the 1890s, thousands of asylum logs, marriage licenses, and census rolls. Clara is nowhere, erased. This absence itself feels purposeful. Did families collude to strike her from the record out of shame? Did church leaders destroy mention to preserve decorum? Or did Clara herself master the art of vanishing, vanishing as completely as silence after a final chord? For many, that silence is her truth. Clara was a silent personified. She bore it, nurtured it between chords, and ultimately disappeared into it. And folklore flourished, because silence is a seedbed for rumor. By World War II, the legend persisted in campfire stories. Soldiers shipped from Pennsylvania carried mutterings, "Don't hum the mourners' chords in trench nights, the shells will find you." Absurd perhaps, yet proof of legend's mobility. Clara became shorthand for death's nearness. In mills, laborers claimed machines hummed her harmonics before fatal accidents. Housewives shushed children mid-song, muttering, "Not that one." "Do you want her hand on our door?" Clara ceased to be a pianist alone. She became omen. Every retelling stretched her further into cultural architecture. Yet unlike other omens, ravens, banshees, her bass was demonstrably human. You can swallow a banshee as a myth, but Clara once breathed. She played real pianos in real houses. What else, audiences ask, might be real if Clara were real? Thus, her vanishing is her strongest note. Because she did not die in public, her afterlife continues. So long as she has no grave, she remains unresolved, lingering to be replayed each time grief enters a household. The resonance continues. The chord is never released. And in that sense, Clara Weiss is endlessly performing her final concert. More than a century has passed since the last confirmed sighting of Clara Weiss at the Lawton House, yet her story refuses to die. It lingers like an echo at the edge of modern life, half folklore, half fact, carried forward by each generation that encounters her tale. And the question now is not whether Clara Weiss truly lived, for her name appears on enough church books and enough funeral records to prove she did, but whether her music ever truly stopped. Perhaps silence is her only composition still ongoing. You see, many ghost stories are quarantined to the past. They belong to castles in Europe, to caverns where no one walks, to legends locked in yellowed books. Clara's story is not so safely imprisoned. It thrives still on the lips of Pennsylvania families who swear they hear faint strains of unseen keys. It surfaces in the studies of scientists curious about resonance, vibration, and how deeply unseen sound can affect human bodies. And it endures because grief itself never dies. Every new century bears funerals. Every family loses someone. And when they do, Clara's music feels close at hand. In today's world of constant technology, of airplanes overhead and digital sound bursting from our pockets, you might think surprise is impossible. But imagine your phone is silent at night, your window rattling faintly, and then you hear it. Notes indistinct but undeniably a human finger's touch on ivory keys. It is said that those who hear such sounds rarely dismiss them as mechanical. Instead, they freeze, because what frightens them is how familiar the music feels, as if it were written for them, as if sorrow itself had commissioned the song. Researchers who have examined Clara's legend often circle back to the same implication. What if hers was not supernatural at all, but a human stumbling upon forces she didn't understand? Isn't that more unsettling than a neat ghost story? Because it means the potential lies close to us too. Somewhere between math and music, grief and resonance, Clara found keys that did not just move hearts, they endangered them. And whether she meant to or not, she proved just how porous the human spirit is when sound presses hard upon it. Clara Weiss represents how easily art can slip into death's hands. Yet the story is also about memory, how one person, stripped of fame, stripped of even a grave, can still become immortal through whispers. She left no heirs, no published music, no portrait sanctioned by wealth. And yet she remains alive in oral tradition, more alive than many who built railroads or sat in grand chairs of politics. That is both chilling and oddly consoling. Immortality granted not by monuments, but by resonance, by the inability of the living to stop repeating her tale. Some say that is the truest ghosthood, when a person lives not in flesh, but in the compulsive need of survivors to speak of them. Perhaps most disturbing, however, is how Clara's story forces us to reconsider trust. She was welcomed into households at their most vulnerable moments. Funerals are sacred spaces of last words, last looks, and last prayers. Families opened doors and allowed her to fill their homes with her music. And in those same moments, calamity arrived. Whether by resonance or darkness, whether by science or by spirit, she corrupted what was meant to comfort. That is the marrow of her horror, not just that people died, but that she turned solace into danger. Might that be why she haunts us still? Because betrayal of grief cuts deeper than any ghost. What should we do with Clara Weiss today? Do we claim her as myth? Lock her away with tales of banshees and black dogs? That would be comfortable. Or do we admit that sometimes truth seethes beneath folklore, demanding we recognize the fragility of our bodies, the raw vulnerability of our ceremonies, the terrifying thinness of the line between elegy and execution? If we choose the second, then Clara does not belong to ghost tours alone, but to history itself, warning quietly from the margins of yellowed paper. And so, each time someone lingers too long on heavy chords at a funeral, or each time a piano in an empty parlor seems to breathe in darkness, we shiver. We shiver because our minds return unbidden to her, the frail woman at the keys, the air thick as lungs forgot to draw, the ultimate note pressing like a coffin's lid. Clara never needed a grave to remain with us. Her music is her epitaph, and silence her monument. Tonight, you followed her story from a child's first note at her sister's funeral to her years of playing only for the dead, through the whispers of neighbors and suspicions of undertakers, to her final performance that left 13 corpses on a polished floor. You have walked alongside the investigators who failed to explain her, the survivors who could not forget her, and the occultists and scientists who argued over her meaning. Where truth ends and legend begins is uncertain, but the impact remains undeniable. Clara Weiss, the pianist who played only at funerals, has lingered across centuries because grief itself never leaves our side. And now, I want to turn this to you. Do you believe Clara Weiss summoned forces she could not control? Do you lean toward science that sound itself sickened fragile hearts? Or do you think she was simply an omen, her presence enough to trigger dread and death because entire communities came to expect it? Tell me in the comments, what do you believe about her story? Was she a victim, a villain, or a vessel? If this journey into Clara's shadow has given you chills, hit that like button to let us know. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss the next story from history's forgotten corners, where myth and death collide. And share this tale with a friend brave enough to listen if they dare invite Clara's song into their night. Because remember, not every silence is empty. Some silences like hers are only the pause between chords. And you never quite know when the next one will play.